Good evening, everyone. I hope you've had a good day, and it's fantastic to be here virtually speaking with you. So I'm Kenneth Bowles. I head up this studio called Now Next. I specialize in ethical design and futures work. And so today I'm going to talk about ethical technology. So this is a space that I've been in for around about 5 years now. And so I'd like to talk about the current trends I'm seeing in ethical technology, give some thoughts on where things are going, what might happen next, and then also focus on how companies and employees and practitioners like yourselves can usefully engage with ethical ideas. So there's quite a lot in that. So it's kind of a fast talk, but I hope we might have a little bit of time for questions afterwards. Failing that, I can also be reached on Twitter or wherever. So hopefully we can catch up then. So if we step back about 10 years ago and look at the tech industry then, the view the general public had, and in fact the view the industry had, was almost universally positive. There were maybe a few dissenting voices, people arguing that actually maybe things weren't quite as rosy as they appeared, but generally there was a very utopian mindset around technology. We had this idea that technology was going to connect people, that it was going to shake up the stagnant hierarchies of the world around us. If we think back to the early part of the last decade, we had, for example, the Arab Spring uprisings, and the narrative, the story, particularly in the West, that was told around those uprisings was that these were partly the result of the connected age, that this was really the mobile revolution, was connecting people, allowing people to come together for a cause and to protest oppressive power in a way they never had been able to before. We also then had the idea that the mobile revolution gave us the world and all of its information right in our pockets. A very positive, very techno-utopian mindset. It's quite clear now that things are really quite different. Things have changed significantly, partly because of the press. The press has been happy to aim a few jabs at the tech industry because I think they see the tech industry as stealing some of their power, some of their authority. But mostly it's really our fault. If there has been a shift in sentiment around technology, that's because of the repeated failings of the tech industry. I think over the last several years, we've shown ourselves to be largely untrustworthy of the power that we've accrued in the world. And so what used to be obscure complaints about technology have now become mainstream problems. There's now a mainstream understanding that technology is not necessarily a positive thing for the world. And so we're starting to see this mainstream awareness creeping into other media as well. And I would talk, for example, about 2 shows on Netflix. I would talk about Black Mirror, this work of dystopian fiction around the future of technology. And then more recently, The Social Dilemma, a documentary that many of you may have seen, featuring Tristan Harris and other contrite technologists talking about all the damages that technology can do. Now, The Social Dilemma is a flawed documentary. It's not been well received within the tech ethics community. But nevertheless, we are seeing a changing narrative, a changing story about the future of technology. And this is now starting to creep into public sentiment. Whereas if we go back, as I say, to the start of the last decade, positive sentiment around the industry, it was very strong. The public really liked technology. They thought positively about the tech industry. But now those attitudes are starting to change. Just over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen drops that you see on screen here. This is from Pew Research, showing that the percentage of people who say that tech companies have a positive effect on things, this is US adults have been polled here, that figure has dropped sharply in the second half of the last decade, from that very high starting point. And what's notable here is this is also happening across the political divide. This isn't just the case that Republicans think that technology is too left-leaning, or that Democrats worry that technology favors the alt-right, for example. This is pretty much across the board. We're starting to see this slip in positive sentiment. A common theme behind that is that technology is really the problems with technology are around social harms. This survey from .Everyone, a UK-based think tank, they found that people generally think that the internet has made life better for them, but it's had a much less positive impact on society overall. And we've now reached the fairly alarming position where there's a widespread lack of trust in what technologists are doing. Only 19% of the British public believe that tech companies design with their best interests in mind. 19% is a terrible figure, and we should be, frankly, ashamed by our low performance in that way. But there's a strange and a profound dissonance happening here, because people are still buying technology. The tech industry is flourishing. Even through COVID, stocks went through the roof. So the public still clearly finds technology useful and beneficial, but they find the industry disempowering. They feel resigned to not have control of their technologies. It's almost like people like technology despite the best efforts of the tech industry. And this crops up in sort of anecdotal distrust. We've all got that friend who insists that their apps are listening to them through their handset, that's tracking them everywhere. But they use it anyway. Well, there's nothing I can do, they will say about it. So I just have to live with it. Now that's a damning indictment of the ethical problems in our industry. And it strikes me that we have to do better than this. And so we are seeing now a drive for change. Employees are starting to pull together and try to get their companies to change direction. Most famously, this has happened at Google. We've had protests at Google over Project Maven. This was a Department of Defense project, basically AI that could be used to pilot drones. And that caused some resignations, protests, and so on. And then the picture you see here, this was the Google walkout over allegations of sexual harassment and a payoff given to a senior executive. And so we've seen this at Google, but we've now also seen similar employee activist movements happening at other tech giants and now some smaller firms as well. And even if there isn't a structured program or anything as dramatic as a walkout or a strike happening, a lot of the clients, in fact, most of the clients I engage with these days, usually have some grassroots discussion of these kind of issues, that employees are starting to really seize that discussion. And this tells me something quite good, which is that technology employees, tech workers, are deeply motivated by values, by ethics, by morality. However, this can look a little bit worrying to leaders, because this sort of activism looks a bit like labor techniques, right? It looks like striking. It looks like kind of left-leaning union politics. And sometimes it is left-leaning politically. But where this differs from the labor movements that we've seen going back over previous decades is the workers here aren't striking for better pay or conditions. They aren't trying to affect change about their own conditions. It's instead about changing the ethical direction and the social impacts of the companies they work for. And it's being relatively effective, albeit quite double-edged. It has been a fairly effective way to mobilize that sort of latent motivation that people have to work for a better company and to create a better world. And so companies are struggling, well, it's not that they're struggling, it's that they realize they can't ignore these issues. They have to recognize and accommodate the fact that employee activism is here to stay. And so there is now this recognition that things have to get a bit better, that ethics and responsibility are not optional topics. They're essential to the future flourishing of business. And so we're seeing a bit more sophistication in these sorts of companies. And the 5 years that I've been in this industry for, in this particular space for, during that time, the conversations around ethics and responsibility have got a lot easier. There's much less of a why, why should this matter? Why do I need to care about this stuff? And much more of a how. Okay, I get it. What do we need to do? The conversation used to be dominated by risk. Risk is kind of the most obvious way that you talk about ethics to a business. You can talk about the risk to customer reputation. You can talk about the risk in terms of talent, how hard it's going to be to hire good, capable, motivated people if you have a bad ethical reputation. Or you can talk about regulatory risk as well, the fact that if you don't act with honor, then essentially, the governments will step in and make you behave in certain ways, which businesses tend not to like having to do. risk is still a useful way to talk about these things, but the conversation has finally become a bit more sophisticated. Companies are now starting to see responsibility and ethics as a genuine advantage. Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at New York University, he's found that the companies that have a positive ethical reputation can command higher prices, they pay less for capital, for equipment and loans, and they can land better talent. So we're now starting to see this conversation that focuses on differentiation, looking better than my competitors and being better than my competitors in the marketplace. And it's starting to become clear that customers do want companies that are values driven. So this kind of mobilization of this advantage, this is starting to happen now, particularly in privacy, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Another sign of maturity that I see is that companies are moving beyond the obvious solutions. When you talk to someone about ethical challenges with technology, it's very common that they might say, well, what we need then is some kind of code of ethics, right? Some published document to say, here is how we should all behave in our field. And, I can see that sort of thing having a place, but we need deeper change than that. It's not just about signing our names to a document. We need some deeper change to the way we design and deliver technologies. So yes, you might need a code of ethics, but you might also need process changes, new methods and tools. You might need oversight committees or sign-off boards. You might need to adopt a formal social purpose for your organization or to create better ethical incentives. And again, these kinds of things are starting to enter into the conversation. Companies realize they can't just create a list of principles or a code of ethics and say, well, that's it, that's ethics done for the year. And now we're starting to see some dedicated teams, some specific hires on ethics positions at certain companies. Microsoft, for example, have an AI ethics and society team. Facebook have a responsible AI team. You may have read recently there's been an article that's been a little bit critical of not that team, but how Facebook has listened to their advice. But nevertheless, they've actually made hires of people with good reputation in this space. Salesforce have a chief ethical and humane use officer, Paula Goldman, who has hired a good team of AI ethics experts, particularly. And so these people, when they're getting hired, their job is usually to try to join up initiatives that are already in progress inside the company, integrating them with things like CSR, corporate social responsibility, or ESG groups, as we might sort of also call them. Now, generally, only the biggest companies need to hire. Most companies don't need to hire a technology ethicist permanently, I would say. Instead, what I'm seeing is some companies creating virtual teams, putting people from projects on a part-time basis to say, how do we want to tackle this as a company, as a design team, as a product team, and so on. So that kind of approach can be valuable as well. Now, despite this positive movement, there is still some concern that it's sometimes easy to do things that look like ethics to score PR points, essentially, but not really making the change required. This is what we might call ethics washing, very much like greenwashing. When this happens, it's usually because incentives haven't moved. People have been hired or a team has been created, but the business still rewards exactly the same behaviors as before. So this is something we continue to fight with, and it's still probably one of the bigger challenges we have within this space. Another strong theme that I'm starting to see is we're realizing at long last the limits of user-centered thinking. Now, I'm a designer, so I've been taught for 20 years pretty much that I always have to focus on the user. And, we have these sort of idealized pictures of the user. We have personas or market segments, and we have usually a very utopian vision of how our product is going to transform their lives. It's going to help them get things done, help them be happier, better individuals. And we've not really questioned that. We've not really interrogated that. What actually happens when we think only of the user is often we're helping that user simply exercise more privilege and more power. We're helping them consume more resources. We're helping them accrue more and more wealth at the expense of others. And because we've been blinded by this optimism about how our product will absolutely transform this person's lives, we overlook the way that technologies can hinder people, can harm people, can stress people out, how they can be imposed upon other people without consent. So we're starting now to realize we have to shift away from this idealized universal user. We are starting to realize that this sort of universal thinking actually narrows the complexity of humanity. What we need is some movement that recognizes the plurality, the diversity of the human race, and that designs and builds systems that fit for everyone, not just a few people. And in doing that, we also then have to build technologies that realize that we affect social relations. We're affecting things like power. So in other words, now technology cannot just be about the individual user. The key thing we know about digital tech is that it has scale. It can reach huge numbers of people at very low cost. If you build a new social network, then you could reach hundreds of millions of active users, if you're lucky, within a few months. So it's right that we realize that our impacts go beyond the individual. Technologies affect families, neighborhoods, cities, and nations. We have to start accounting for those in our thinking. So there's this emerging theme, particularly in design, to say, well, what we need is not user-centered design, but maybe it's human-centered design. I'd actually argue we have to go further than that. Maybe we should be looking at society-centered design, planet-centered design, life-centered design. And I kind of quite like those as framings. We've certainly ignored those perspectives for far too long in our work. The challenge is that there aren't, again, the incentives for that line of thinking. If we protect democracy inside our companies, that still really won't affect the share price. There's this old, it's almost becoming a cliche now, that a tree is worth more dead than alive. There really aren't many incentives within our economic systems to protect democracy, society, neighborhoods, cities, the planet, and so on. So these broader views of our impact, they're tricky for businesses to understand. They sort of struggle to gain traction sometimes. Now, maybe that will change. Maybe regulation will force our hand, or new incentives will start to emerge. But right now, this is still a challenge we're always working against, that tide, if you like. Moving on to some trends that I'm seeing starting to bubble up, and let's look at where those might take us. COVID-19 has now been with us for a year, and we still don't know exactly what shape the world will take on the other side. I think back to pretty much this time last year, and we had these breathless articles that said, well, okay, COVID is a dramatic and terrible shift for society, but if there's one silver lining, is that there might be a better world to come on the other side, where we reduce our consumption, we reduce our greenhouse emissions, and so on. Now, I'm still fairly skeptical of that. I think it's just as likely that we'll desperately bounce back into overconsumption, after living for this painful year of enforced moderation. But I think we are still at some kind of crossroads. Certainly our relationship with technology has changed significantly. Working from home, certainly in the West, has become pretty much a default behavior now. And so certainly some things will change. So we can and we should use this moment to talk about the world that we want on the other side of COVID, what values we want to adopt, what exploitative practices we want to drop, because we might not get an opportunity of this scale, of this magnitude again. One more confident prediction I can make is that regulation will continue to increase. I do a lot of privacy design work, and there's a lot of movement in privacy. GDPR in the EU certainly isn't perfect, but it's given teeth. It's given force to regulations in a way that they haven't had before. British Airways got fined £183 million for a significant data breach. That got reduced later, but still, compared to the previous maximum they could have got under the old laws, which was $250,000, it's an enormous incentive for companies to take these things seriously. And then there have been changes in not just the EU, of course, India, I understand, has had some significant progress on privacy in recent years. Brazil now has a new federal privacy law. The US may even look to introduce some federal privacy regulation, but we'll see how that goes. They've got a lot of other priorities right now, but certainly under a Biden administration, it looks more plausible than it did under Donald Trump. Maricha Chaka, who's a former EU Parliament member and now I think works in Stanford's Cyber Research Center, has this quote here: "There are currently only two dominant systems of technology governance, the privatized one, which applies in the entire democratic world, and an authoritarian one." So what Chaka means here is that essentially democracies really haven't regulated technology. The only countries, the only states that have are the authoritarian regimes, particularly China, but a few others. The rest of the world has left technology to really regulate itself as an industry. Now that gap will narrow for sure, and Maricha Chaka would say that it has to narrow for the sake of democracy. And partly technology is going to drift into spaces that have more regulation anyway, particularly financial services. There's a lot of existing regulation there that the industry will have to look at. But it's very likely that we will see more regulation on things like facial recognition, which already has a number of challenges and bans in the US, and occasionally a couple of places across Europe have banned police or public use of this stuff. We're going to see more controls for sure. Explainable AI, so AI decisions. GDPR has some very light requirements that you have to be able to explain how a decision is taken. But the EU clearly has an appetite to regulate AI more. So it might even be that certain countries and certain areas start to require AI decisions to be explainable, that it will be illegal to use AI to make a decision for the user unless you are able to explain that decision after you've made it. In California, for example, it's already illegal to use a bot for commerce or for political influence without disclosing that it's a bot. We'll also see regulation around elections. We know that elections are vulnerable to digital interference. We saw that in 2016 with the Brexit vote and particularly Donald Trump's election. So we're going to see more laws on who's paying for advertising online, and probably laws around fake video, synthetic audio and video, something like that, to protect against disinformation. And then dark patterns, a phrase that you may well be familiar with, deceptive interfaces, essentially always run the risk of being seen as anti-competitive or fraudulent. So it's likely we'll see more regulation around them. But the challenge, of course, is that different territories, different countries will have their own approaches. And it's going to be increasingly difficult to be compliant the world over. And so it's quite likely that we'll end up diverging. Some analysts have talked about the idea of splinter nets, that essentially the idea of a single internet just isn't sustainable, and that we'll end up probably with an American internet, a European internet, and a Chinese internet as the three primary sort of dominant sub-internets, and then other nations, other areas will hook into those somewhere. There's been some political motivation to diverge as well, again, particularly between Trump and China. And so we'll see how that trend continues. But it seems unlikely that companies will be able to meet all those laws equally across all those territories. So we may well see some fragmentation of services. We're also going to see companies starting to fight back through their user bases to actually get them to do their political campaigning for them. This was an unskippable modal dialogue that Uber put in their app before Prop 22. This was a Californian measure, essentially, that wanted to treat Uber drivers as employees. It would have been catastrophic for Uber's business. And so they put pressure on their users to say, you cannot let this pass. You have to campaign against it on our behalf. Facebook have threatened to pull out of the entire European continent if certain data protection rulings don't go their way. So we're going to see more of this kind of weaponization, stirring up of public fury by the tech giants. Now, for me, I think this is shameful, unethical stuff, but sadly it works. So I think it's highly likely that we'll see more of this kind of public pressure. We're also talking about the future, and so we simply have to discuss the most important moral theme of the coming century, which is climate change, which is about the same as aviation. And now we're moving into the world of video streaming, 5G. These are much more energy intensive technologies, and still the data centers that are powering these technologies are still mostly powered off dirty energy as well. Now, there has been some good work. Apple and Facebook and Google deserve significant credit for decarbonizing their companies and their supply chains. There's also some noticeably bad work. Amazon have been particularly poor on the degrowth. Now, some people would say if we solve this, we sort of solve all the other ethical problems. I don't think it's that easy, but it's clear that if we fail to address the enormous ecological issues facing the world, not just the tech industry, then this century will be a century of misery and suffering, to be honest. So this it's right that these issues have risen to the top, and they need to stay there. But despite the urgency of all these changes, there's actually a little bit of a pushback right now. There are some companies who are trying to step back and say we're not going to be part of the ethical discussion at all. It's almost like a backlash against the backlash, or a techlash. Now, this might be because companies think, well, this is a complex field. It might be because they think it's too political. But whatever the cause, it's essentially reviving some ideas from the 1970s, specifically what is known as the Friedman Doctrine. Milton Friedman, the economist, almost exactly 50 years ago, pretty much 50 years ago, published this article, this piece in the New York Times magazine, I think it was, which says that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And in fact, Friedman says that's the only social responsibility a business has, and that any social impact other than profit is pure and unadulterated socialism. And so that simply shouldn't be permitted. Now, this has been a divisive piece, but it's also been an influential piece. It's inspired a lot of free market policy in the 1980s. Think Ronald Reagan, think Margaret Thatcher. And a lot of chief executives said the only purpose of my business is to generate profit, and everything else we ignore. Now, the good news is I think the tide has turned. Like, this attitude has brought us massive inequality, exploitation, climate crisis, and we know now that we cannot go along that way, and public attitudes have changed. But nevertheless, there's still the grain of that idea somewhere within the industry. Last year, Coinbase, the crypto wallet company, published this article, or Brian Armstrong, the chief exec, wrote this piece and essentially said, well, we don't do politics here. We won't talk about politics. We won't talk about social impact at our company anymore. That will not be permitted. The only thing we discuss is our company and our goal. And they even paid staff money to leave the company if they weren't happy with that decision. They had this wonderful quote here: life is too short to work somewhere that you aren't excited about, and we're happy to make that a win-win conversation. Essentially, saying we'll fire you if you talk politics at work. And 5% of the entire workforce said, you know what, I'm not happy with that, and they took the money to leave. Now, I can understand this with some limitations. Coinbase maybe think this is swampy territory, or we've got too much we have on our plates. We can't be getting involved in these issues. And at least they're making it clear what kind of a company they want to be and what values they want to live by. But for me, there's a profound self-deception happening here. It is absurd for a cryptocurrency company to say that they don't have anything to do with politics. The entire sector is enormously political. It's built upon libertarian ideals, the idea of free trade being better than state control. It's historically quite hostile to central banking and to tax. Now, you can believe in that stance or not. That's not my decision to make, but it's laughable to suggest that that's not a political choice. And so this is kind of one of the most important things that companies have to realize. You can't not engage with this. Not engaging with ethics, not engaging with politics, that is itself an ethical and political choice. It's a vote essentially for the status quo, for what we currently have around us in the industry, in the world. And that might be fine. You might be happy with that. But that must be a conscious decision, because your work has those consequences whether you pay attention to them or not. So it's better to handle them thoughtfully, to discuss them, to try to reduce and mitigate the damage you can do, rather than just shrug your shoulders and say, this isn't really my problem. So there is this anti-ethics, anti-politics reaction that's happening right now, and it's having a small moment, but in my view, it's really not sustainable in the long run. So if we commit to taking these choices more seriously, how do we do that? What's our advice to companies and employees who want to take further ethical and responsible steps? Well, the first one is to lose a bad habit I think that the industry has, which is that we like to think that we are the first brave explorers on any new shore. And when I got into the field of ethics, I was amazed by the depth of work in technology ethics that I had no idea existed. And there have been people in the humanities, your osophists and your ologists, right? Your artists, writers, and critics as well. All these people have been exploring the social impacts of technology for decades, but our industry has pretty much ignored them, either ignored them or not understood them. And instead, these academics or these writers and critics, they've been watching us from the sidelines, seeing us running headlong into the same old traps as before, and they're sort of tearing their hair out saying, well, why won't industry listen? And it's time that we did. So here are a few books I might suggest tech industry, but the point is to listen to those other perspectives, not to try and solve everything from ourselves. The second is to create space to do this work. You have to start by creating anticipation space. Now, if you talk to a real ethicist, and I wouldn't call myself an ethicist per se, but if you talk to a professional ethicist, they might tell you that what you need is moral imagination, this wonderful phrase they've got. It's essentially meaning that we have to think about potential future states, what might happen next, and discuss who wins or loses in those states and how we can make them fairer. So here's my very ugly and rough attempt to map out what I think a responsible design process looks like. First, you need to take the time to anticipate the potential harms or the damage that you might be doing. You need to then evaluate how serious those are and compare and rank them. Then you might need to, bear with me a second, sorry, I just closed that. For some reason, Siri just interrupted me. You need to rank how important those are, and then you need to try to reduce the negative impacts and potentially capitalize on the positive impacts. And then you might need some kind of infrastructure beneath that to support that process in future. Now let's just focus on that first step, that anticipation. Now this is an idea that bluntly is out of fashion in the tech industry. Lean and Agile have got this mentality that's very empirical. They tell us that essentially you can't possibly predict everything, so don't even bother. Build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, and then incrementally work your way toward a solution that works, which makes sense for product work, but it is a terrible idea, frankly, when it comes to ethics, because it treats ethical damage as something that you can fix later, right? You just create a bunch of ethical damage and you say, oh, well, we'll get to that in the next release. But that doesn't work. It's this idea that's come to plague the industry of move fast and break things. That works fine if the thing you're breaking is an upload interface for your photos. It's a terrible thing if what you're breaking is democracy. So we can't do that. We have to find a way to anticipate the moral damage that our decisions might do. You'll never get all of them, but you'll get some, and so that's a start. And so you can use things like design critique or project postmortems, anywhere where you're already asking tough questions, essentially. That's a perfect opportunity to bring in some ethical question to that space. And what I'd recommend for doing that is two free resources to begin with. There's Ethical Explorer. This is essentially a card deck of risk mapping exercises. So there's a card for surveillance, a card for disinformation, exclusion, and it comes with a series of prompt questions. So you can bring your team and say, hey, how might we be contributing to surveillance? What can we do to reduce that? How can we lead the way with a more ethical alternative? This is easy to drop in to an existing conversation, right? Take an afternoon with your team, get that card deck out, which is available for free. You can download it, or I think they still have printed copies, and run through it with your team. On the right-hand side, this is Ethics and Tech Practice Toolkit from Santa Clara University, sort of more immersive, a bit more theoretical, but still very good set of prompt questions for technologists to work through. Another thing that we need to start doing is designing with people, not just for. You know, I talked about the idea of this ideal user really not working in the modern age, and instead we have to embrace the plurality of humanity. Now, designers talk about empathy a lot here, and they say, well, what you need is empathy. But actually, no, that's not even enough, because what that does is it still means we take all the decisions. We still, we have all the power to take those calls. And it turns what should be democratic decisions into technocratic decisions taken by the elites like me, bluntly. And so we have to find ways to involve people, to work directly with a wider range of people, bringing them into research, into workshops, into testing, co-designing with them. So designing not at people or even for people, but designing directly with people, radically including them in the design process to build a better world that works well for a larger number of people. Now, as you do that, some political issues will start to raise their head. And this gets scary for businesses because they don't like politics. Now, ethics should still matter to you. And you can use and apply proper, robust ethical theory, all the stuff that was in those books that I mentioned a few slides ago. You can apply that to evaluate decisions without being clouded by the politics. So I think it's a vital and a real topic. For me, ethics is about how we choose to live our lives every day, which we have to treat with the importance that it deserves. I mentioned this idea of infrastructure as well. You might need to build actives. You might need these documents like codes of ethics or position statements, core values. You might need some measurements and benchmarks to track your progress over time in measurable ways. Or maybe for really high risk decisions, then you need something like oversight board. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, we've got to rethink ethics itself, change the way that we consider these topics. I think too many people see ethics as something negative. They think, I think incorrectly, but they think that it's subjective, that it's obstructive, it's going to slow innovation down. And I see it quite differently. It's true that ethics is going to help you avoid certain things, so it can be obstructive in some ways. It will help you dodge really bad decisions. But it's also a positive force. It's not just a constraint. I think ethics is a seed of innovation. And so the analogy I use here is a trellis, that your commitment to ethics builds the frame around which and through which your products can grow. And they will take on the shape of your values. Your thoughtfulness, your compassion, your honesty will reveal themselves through the details of your products. And that's a powerful advantage because it helps us stand out in a wildly crowded marketplace. It'll help you make better decisions, help you build the trust that keeps customers loyal for life. And if we get that right, then not only do our companies compete, but we also flourish as employees. But even more than that, we help to build a fairer and more sustainable world. And after all, isn't that what we all want from our work and indeed from our lives? So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That is a truly captivating and enlightening talk about ethical concerns in the world of technology. And we greatly appreciate the very relevant examples that you provided. And we're deeply concerned with the regulations that need to be put into practice urgently. And I see a couple of good questions here. Someone asked, some of the practices that you mentioned, such as dark patterns, do not have easily defined parameters and therefore have the possibility of escaping regulation. How do we tackle these in a holistic manner?
Yeah, so we tackle them ourselves. There are some people who look to regulation to solve everything, but there will always be things that go unregulated. And the legal baseline, the legal minimum, is not a good moral minimum. So we have to aim higher. So how we tackle these is I would personally love to see our professional organizations taking a stronger stance. That would be, you mentioned holistic. That would be the best way, is for, the Interaction Design Association, for example, to say, here is how designers should handle dark patterns. And that would probably be, they don't do them, right? They refuse to make them. That would be the best way. However, they've been reluctant to issue that kind of guidance. So what I like to do is to start to build that wisdom or that accepted practice within our community, within these conversations. So exactly like that question, that is the right time to have these questions asked, is in events like this. What do we as a community want to do as technologists? Well, we should say we shouldn't be doing dark patterns. So that's the ideal way is to mobilize the community around this. If you can't do that, then you do it within your company. So you might have opportunity to write design principles, for example, or to list out your core values. And in those, you actually try to explain what you mean by a dark pattern, and why you won't, or why you don't think it's a good thing, and what you'll do instead. So that's the best way. And then always at the end of the line, there's probably some designer or product manager or someone who has to say, I'm not going to do that. And that's risky. You need to have the sort of safety and security and the authority to do that, to be listened to. But if you have that comfort in your career, in your company, in your job, then people like you need to stand up and make those calls.
I see another question. Says, since most tech giants follow the ideals of Friedman Doctrine, would it be a good idea to incentivize companies to push them towards being more ethically responsible?
Personally, I think that would be a terrific idea. And I would love to see, reframing of our economic systems to make that more common. There are some companies that do that themselves, of course. And you're looking here mostly at B Corps, benefit corps, who value what they call the triple bottom line. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this: people, planet, and profit. And those are equally important to these companies. I would love to see more tech companies becoming B Corps. At the moment, Kickstarter is a B Corp. Etsy were very close, but actually they rejected it in the end. Their board rejected that. I would love to see Facebook, for example, become a B Corp. It's never going to happen. But yes, I think in fact we have to impress upon businesses that they have social responsibilities beyond profit. And frankly, if we're going to live through this next century without the kind of dramatic damage that lurks around the corner, with particularly climate crisis, then everyone has their role to play, and business is a part of that too.
I don't see any more questions. So they're asking if you could share the link that you said about the books that you shared in your presentation.
Absolutely. So there's a chat, so I will pop those in the chat straight after this.
Anyone, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to pass it on to Cennydd.
The other thing is, given my name is spelled quite unusually, I'm very easy to find online. So if you want to get hold of me, just search Cennydd, Cennyd. You'll find me. I'm mostly on Twitter, but wherever you can find me, drop me a question and I'll happily chat.
I guess that's it. So thanks a lot, sir, for doing this, for joining in. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. Really appreciate it, sir.
My pleasure. Been fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.